Good morning. I'm here to speak briefly to you all about one question. What good is the past for a pastor? Once, probably 2 years ago, I had a student in my History of Christianity in America class, which is a class that everyone has to take, so I'll see you there at some point. And they told me right away, you seem like a nice person. I'm not going to get anything out of this class. I don't like history, which is definitely the first thing you should say to a professor when you get started. And I think that actually, I was glad he said it out loud, because I think that a lot of people, that's how they come into classes about history. They don't automatically think that history has something for them. And so I just wanted to give you something to think about, hopefully over time, about what the past can do for you in your ministry context, whether or not you're a pastor, although I know we have many of them here. There's a lot of different things that a historical mind can do for your life in the ministry. Some of them are petty, which is great, and some of them are actually really important. So some of the pettier ones, it can give you a way to say, I told you so. You know, like the cheap versions of this are like bring up the Nazis. Everyone does that. You might bring up the Crusades. That's another version of that. You can also, though, use it to get in a theological wrestling match with one of your congregation members. You can talk about, you can use it like legal precedent. Well, the church in the past has done such and such a thing. That tends to have mixed results, to be honest. Usually, more effective versions of this are using the past for inspiration, talking about kind of the greats in church history. That's really helpful. You can use it as a warning. I actually think that is helpful. So say, for example, you're in my History of Christianity in America class, and we look at the liberal fundamentalist controversy, which was an event that happened around 100 years ago, and it divided American Protestantism along the lines of liberalism and conservatism, and it was a horribly painful and damaging time in the church, and we're still feeling the effects of that today. I think that you can deploy that in a helpful way. But I want to talk about something that a need that pastors have that I've recognized in my life, being raised as a pastor's daughter and then being married to a pastor. And this is what I want to pose to you, that church history can actually be a balm for loneliness in the ministry. If there's one thing that my spouse and my father had in common when it came to their approach to the ministry, it was this. I watched them struggle with loneliness for many years, because the ministry can be a really isolating occupation. The ministry is one of those weird things. It's sort of like waiting tables. I used to wait tables all the way through graduate school. It's something like, just because people enjoy food doesn't mean they know anything about food service. Am I right? Same thing applies to the ministry. Just because they enjoy going to church doesn't mean they know anything about what it takes to actually do church from a leadership perspective. And so that can be really lonely, because a lot of people think they know what your job is and definitely how you ought to be doing your job, right? But you know that that's not the truth. So it can be lonely, and in our current cultural context, that's even more heightened, because people have so many other ways of evaluating you against other ministers. Why don't you preach like T.D. Jakes? Well, I don't know. T.D. Jakes is a superstar. Why don't you do the kind of ministry that I've seen so-and-so doing? Their Clicktivist Facebook account is telling me that they're doing all these amazing things. We don't really actually know if that's true, but whatever. So you're being evaluated by these external forces in ways, unprecedented ways. And then people who are ministering are also on call 24/7, because why didn't you see my Facebook post, right? Or why didn't you see whatever it was that I put on Twitter? So you all who are serving the church so faithfully are under a lot of pressure, and what I'd like to offer to you today is to say that the voices of the past can provide wisdom and assistance, and maybe even a voice in a time of trouble. So, for example, what if you are ministering in a context wherein you're dealing with the effects of this current opioid crisis? Maybe you could find some help and some companionship by looking at the life and ministry of John Wesley, who was also dealing with the effects of substance abuse in the form of distilled liquor in his context. Maybe you're struggling with how to be a faithful public witness. Why not walk alongside the incomparable ministries of Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin Luther King Jr., and the many, many greats of the American Civil Rights Movement? Maybe you're wrestling with how to be a pastor who incorporates creativity and the arts. Hildegard van Bingen is a great example. Maybe the ministry of Aimee Semple McPherson is one of my favorites. In your ministry, I think that the usefulness and the help of having a historical mind, which is what we'll work on in classes on historical theology or church history, one of the major advantages is that you get to think alongside and really dwell with some of the voices of the past. G.K. Chesterton has this great phrase that he uses when he talks about church tradition. He talks about it as the democracy of the dead. The saints who've gone before you are voicing the words of God, and you get to walk along with them. I want to share just a tiny story of how I've recently experienced that in my own life as an encouragement to you all. And I have to say that being a professor is not as hard as being a pastor. That's just, I'm going to say that. We have some professors who have also been pastors. I bet they'd agree with me. One very recent thing happened to me. As a professor, kind of your dream is to develop, I think most of us have a dream of developing a public voice so that we can speak out and make a good difference in the world. Right? But one of the things, so you spend years and years training yourself how to do this, how to talk about things in a way that's both accessible and challenging, and something that will build up the life of the church in public. But what they don't tell you when you're training with these things is how difficult that is, and how often that is accompanied by intense self-doubt and anxiety, right? So recently, I put myself out there in a public way, and it was something that I believed in, but I got a lot of backlash. In fact, I got hate mail for the first time, which was really interesting. And in fact, I was called, I'm from the Pentecostal world. If you don't know anything about Foursquare, that's our home base. I was called a tool of Satan, which is classic Pentecostal move. And I was trying to put a good public face on it and trying to act like it was no big deal, but I was a wreck. So I called a really good friend of mine, and I was crying on the phone, and I am not a crier, but I was torn up about it, and I was feeling a lot of self-doubt. And this wise friend, asked me a question and said, Leah, you've studied a lot about Aimee Semple McPherson, and she is the founder of the Foursquare Church that I grew up in, and has been my constant companion for decades now, because I wrote a lot about her. And my friend said, what would she do in this situation? And I thought about it for a second, and I knew exactly what she would do. And I told my friend, well, she'd stop crying, she'd put more makeup on, and she'd get back at it. Right? And my friend said, I think that's what you should do. So that one moment was so profound for me personally, because it was the voice of the past speaking alongside me and spurring me on in the work, right? So that was, as the scriptures say, as Hebrews says, she was a part of that great cloud of witnesses cheering on this work. And so what I want to say to you is the value of what you're doing now. The Bible's really great. Dr. Gupta, I want you to hear me saying that. The Bible's really great. But church history is also really great, right? Why? Because it lets you know that there is a cloud of people walking alongside you, cheering you on, and it lets you know in a deep and profound way that you are not alone. Thank you.